Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, Denmark announced that starting tomorrow, February 1st, nearly all COVID restrictions inside the country will be dropped. When making the announcement, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said, "We say goodbye to the restrictions and welcome the life we knew before." This comes despite COVID cases soaring higher than they've ever had in the country, as well as hospitalizations and deaths fairly high as well. Despite the climb, Denmark says it's time to move on. What gives? Well, Mette Frederiksen acknowledged this, saying it may seem strange that we want to remove restrictions given the high infection rates, but fewer people become seriously ill. And she isn't wrong. Denmark's case rate is soaring, but a much lower percentage of those cases end up in the ICU. And this could be due to Denmark's 81% vaccination rate, or it could be due to the fact that most cases in Denmark are of the less severe Omicron and Omicron's cousin. If you haven't heard, there's a new variant of Omicron that's reportedly 1.5 times more transmissible, but isn't showing to be any more severe. Denmark is reporting that cousin makes up about half of their cases. The restrictions being lifted include mask wearing, restrictions on the number of people allowed to gather in various situations, and COVID passport mandates for things like restaurants, movies, bars, events, and other gatherings. The COVID passport in Denmark required people to show proof of vaccination, recovery from prior infection, or a negative test within the past 72 hours. But as of tomorrow, that's over. The only restrictions that'll still be in place include masks for hospitals and nursing homes, and there will be some border control measures. Denmark will require unvaccinated travelers to test either prior to or upon entry into the country, depending on where one is traveling from. I'm not sure what the point of that is, considering the virus is spreading amongst both vaccinated and unvaccinated nearly equally, but whatever. Anyone can get into Denmark fairly easily. Though this lifting of restrictions and going back to normal might seem like a reason to celebrate, this isn't the first time Denmark has announced dropping restrictions. Back in August, Denmark announced that due to the country's high 70% vaccination rate, the pandemic was under control, no longer a critical threat, and all restrictions would be lifted on September 10th. But by the beginning of November, cases began to climb, and the prime minister then announced new restrictions for the unvaccinated, claiming the vaccination rate, which had gone up to 75% at that time, wasn't high enough to control the pandemic. She said, quote, "We cannot let the virus run wild in Denmark. For all of you who are vaccinated, unvaccinated, things are going to become more difficult. And that's also how I think it should be," she added. Now, at that time in November, Denmark was averaging 2,500 cases per day. A month later, with Omicron taking over and case rates soaring in the fully vaccinated, Denmark announced another round of controls, including bars, restaurants, and clubs to close early, and kids moved back to online learning. And at that time, Denmark was recording about 10,000 cases per day. Now, here we are, a month and a half later, and Denmark has decided it's time to move on, even though they're recording a little over 40,000 cases a day. Of course, they've announced that they reserve the right to bring restrictions back if the situation changes, but paying less attention to the case numbers and more attention to severe hospitalizations is a direction countries are beginning to go in. Spain has announced their desire to move to the endemic phase, where they also pay less attention to case numbers and focus only on hospitalizations. This week in the UK, there will be no more restrictions except to self-isolate if tested positive. Traveling to the UK is also eased up, with the only restriction being a test taken prior to or entry for the unvaccinated. Norway did the same thing as Denmark, announced the removal of restrictions and a return to normal, only to swiftly bring back restrictions when cases went back up. Norway never implemented restrictions against the unvaccinated, but they did something else controversial recently. In mid-December, they actually stopped the sale of alcohol in bars and restaurants. And the logic was, when people get drunk, they get loud and loose. And when they're loud and shouting, there's more droplets in the air. People start to relax when they're drunk, and they get closer to one another as well. So I guess there was some science around it, but it didn't go over very well. That lasted about a month. Despite cases, hospitalizations, and deaths being at their highest this wave in Norway, they're easing restrictions anyway. Now, you can get a beer, but only until 11 p.m. and only when seated at a table. The country still has capacity restrictions, masking requirements, and social distancing of at least 3 feet in various settings, but they've indicated these restrictions could ease soon. Now, Iceland says that they're going to be lifting their measures by mid-March. The country has minimal restrictions compared to others as it is, and never implemented restrictions against the unvaccinated. Masks are only worn if you can't stay 3 feet apart. Kids 17 and under in school never wear masks. And in preschool settings, neither the children nor the adults wear masks. Kids 5 and under are never asked to wear a mask in any circumstance whatsoever. The country has some restrictions on the size of gatherings and types of gatherings, but that's about it. To get into Iceland, one must test upon arrival. Unvaccinated travelers must test and isolate for a few days and then test again. So Sweden says they're going to be assessing the situation February 9th and could lift all of their restrictions by then. Currently, Sweden has capacity rules as well as social distancing recommendations. They also have a rule that only fully vaccinated people can attend large gatherings, such as movies and concerts, though Sweden is seeing a record number of cases. Unlike Denmark and Norway, for example, Sweden's death rate hasn't significantly climbed this wave. So the big question people are asking is, when is it time to stop counting cases and start focusing on ICU admissions for and not with COVID? When can we drop restrictions and go back to normal? That's the big question. So curious, Robbie and Ryan, this is like deja vu with Denmark, deja vu with Norway. Denmark in particular saying, we're back, everything's fine, and it's no longer a socially critical disease. They did this before. They went back into restrictions, and now they're saying once again it's not critical. Spain is saying it's time. This is endemic. One thing I will say that is kind of misleading is that there are a lot of hospitalizations that are showing to be COVID hospitalizations, but those hospitals and those doctors are reporting that these are people that are there in the hospital coming in for other reasons, and then they test positive for COVID either before getting there or while they're there, and then they're counted as a COVID case, but they're not there for COVID. So that is, I think, why Denmark is saying, yeah, even though the hospitalization rates look really high, especially for kids, those are not hospitalizations for COVID. They showed up for something else, and then they tested positive. So that's why they're saying it's no longer socially critical. We're just not seeing tons of ICU admissions for COVID. So I don't know. I mean, at what point do you think we're going to get to this? We're going to stop. If we were to stop counting cases today here in the United States, do you think people would freak out?
Yes.
Or do you think they'd welcome it?
Well, half the country would welcome it and half the country would freak out. We're such a closely divided country. Although, liberals used to always say, right, we should be more like Europe. Oh, they do everything better in Europe, especially Northern Europe, especially the countries you're talking about, Denmark,
right,
Norway, Sweden, etc. Okay, so I agree. We should be more like Europe. For the first time in my life, I agree. Europe is doing this better. We should be more like Europe. But I'm not hearing that from the liberals on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I warned very early in this pandemic that if liberals went too far and too irrational in some of their early policies, like kicking people off the beach, kicking people out of parks, the more extreme stuff, then they were going to lose credibility when later there are scientifically backed restrictions that are useful to implement at a time where the hospitals are overwhelmed. And to me, the hospital capacity is the key measure. Like that's to me what signals whether you're in an emergency situation. If you can't get a routine appointment for something other than COVID because the medical system is just so pressed upon, then something has to be done, socially broadly. But if that's not the case, then I think it's time to ease the restrictions. We've had this virus pull the football away twice so far, right? The first with Alpha, there was that month where everybody's like, well, that pandemic sucked, but it's basically over. People are partying, people are like hugging, not just in red states, but everywhere. And then Delta comes in. You saw it again, right before Omicron. It does feel like we're getting to a place where we now have the real potential that this is in the rearview mirror, right? I've been operating as if it's over for a long time now, so it is over for me personally. Yes, when will it be over sufficiently for the relevant health officials or the tyrants who rule over us? I don't know, maybe never. I'm honestly, I'm having a hard time trying to predict what the government officials and the public health bureaucracy that they rely on, what their thinking is, what their calculus is, because the goalposts have moved so many times, and it was going to be vaccine and done, and now it's like. Unfortunately, the virus has a say in it. Yeah. Hopefully, the virus just goes away. I would love it to, or we make we can offer the virus a deal. Spread as much as you want.
but just don't make people sick or something.
There you go.
And
that is often the deal.
But the virus's representatives
Right.
have not responded to a request for comment. So.
Well, and that's what's going, with Scandinavia, one thing I also want to point out is that recently there was the World Corruption Index that comes out, and, we see this kind of come out every single year. And every single year, the Scandinavian countries are the least corrupt in the entire world. And one thing I've noticed in following them when it comes to the pandemic is they have been the most transparent. I mean, Iceland is very, very transparent with all of its data. You could go to their website, you could parse through it. They are not at all political with it. And that has been the case for Denmark's a little bit, I would say, they're a little bit more in line with the rest of Europe than the rest of Scandinavia. They kind of are a little bit of an outlier. Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland tend to be more aligned, and then Denmark kind of does its own little thing once in a while. But, Sweden, for example, when they made the restriction against the unvaccinated for large groups only, their reasoning wasn't to punish them or to try to get them to be vaccinated. They said, listen, you're just more likely to get infected if you go to these large gatherings. And if you're unvaccinated, you're more likely to end up in the hospital. And so we're just trying to prevent you from getting into the hospital because we're trying to keep our hospitalizations down. And so they approached everything they did, even restrictions, from this scientific viewpoint. Even like Norway banning alcohol, it seems so strange, but actually the reasoning, again, it wasn't, we're trying to punish you. They're just like, look, you're going to start shouting when you get drunk. And then when you're shouting, those droplets are spraying at the people all around you. And we just can't have you doing that. And so even these,
it's as if they were talking about me.
Start hugging.
Right, exactly. They knew about you. So it's been interesting watching Scandinavia. It's been interesting watching and studying their response to the pandemic because they've taken such a scientific approach. There are also countries that they have banned the use of certain vaccines. They're not using vaccines on young people. A lot of the Scandinavian countries are not doing restrictions on unvaccinated at all. So it's been interesting following them. And I do think that they've maintained, because of it, a high level of public trust to what you're saying, Ryan. I think that here we're seeing an erosion, but I think they're not. And that's a very interesting thing. So we'll see if we go back to Norway, if the rest of the world follows Scandinavia's direction. But we haven't in many other ways that I'm a big fan of. I know you're not, Robbie, but I'm a big fan of Scandinavia's economics. And we'll see if we, if we ignore them or if we follow them.
Well, before we get into that, we have to wrap it up right there. Thank you, Kim. We'll have more Rising right after this.